Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this tutorial, we're going to understand how to create the second normalized form using MongoDB collection with Node and Express. So let me first explain what is first normalized form. Let's suppose that you have the author collection in MongoDB database. You have author collection, or you can say the author model with name, bio, website, title, and subtitle fields. And you might have your own fields inside this author collection. In relational database management system, this is what we call a first normalized form table. We have all the data of the author with the book details. In this type of table, or you can say collection, you might have duplicate data. To solve this, you can use second normalized form. Let's see what is the benefit of using second normalized form. In second normalized form, the data is consistent in the database. So there is no duplicate data in the table. It also improves the overall organization of the data in the database. So instead of first normalized form, now we are going to convert this table into second normalized form. So to convert it, we create two models. First is author and second is books. In the author, we have name, bio, and website fields. Inside a books collection, we create title, subtitle, and author field. You can notice the author field with the author ID. The author ID is linked with the author name. So when we grab the book's detail, we can easily access the author ID. We don't have primary key in MongoDB. So let's see how we can create the second normalized form in MongoDB NoSQL database. Enough ready? Let's dive into the project. So I'm going to first open the Visual Studio Code and create a backend server with Node and Express. You can notice here I have a server folder, and inside that server I have the server.js file. Inside this, I'm simply going to set up the backend of this application. I'm going to import Express, create different routes here, and connect the MongoDB database with this Express application. So when I start the development server, I'm going to first check the connection of the MongoDB database and then start the backend server. Here I have a controller. Inside that, I'm going to have app.controller file. We don't have anything here. Inside the database, we have the connection file, which used to connect this database to the MongoDB. Then we have the data.js file, where we have all the data of the authors. So we have all the author details inside this array of objects. Just are that inside these routes, we have app.route file, and we don't have any routes inside this route file. And inside this config.js, we're simply going to call the MongoDB in-memory server to create a simple instance of the MongoDB. Instead of using the MongoDB Atlas, just for this example, I'm using a MongoDB server. Now, just like that, let's back to the app controller and create controllers for this application. So now once we have a valid MongoDB connection, let me just start the development server. So I'm going to open the terminal, and here I'm going to say npm start. So this command is going to start the development server. So you're going to get here a message, database connected, and server is connected to localhost 8080. Now once we successfully started the server, let's create a model for this application. As I said, we are going to use second normalized form. So instead of creating just the author model in this project, we're going to create two different models. First for the author and second for the books. So inside the server folder, here I'm going to create a new folder with the name model. And here I'm going to create two files. First for the books. So I'm going to say book.model.js. You can notice how I named this file, book.model.js. This indicates this file is only used for the model. Just out of that, inside this model, here I'm going to create another file with the name author.model.js. Inside this books.model.js, right here, I'm going to create a schema for the books model. As you know, to create schema in MongoDB, you need to first import the mongoose from the mongoose model, and then you have to call constant book model is equal to, and then you call mongoose dot schema. And inside this schema, you're going to specify fields to this MongoDB schema. So let's specify fields to this MongoDB schema. So I'm going to copy and paste here title field with the type string, and we specify here a require message. Just out of that, inside the books, we also have a subtitle. So we call here a subtitle of the type string. And after that, just out of this subtitle, here I'm going to call the author field. And inside this author field, you have to store the author ID. So I'm going to specify here type. This is a type of object. So we call here mongoose dot schema dot types dot object. So we call here object ID. So now the type of this field is a type of MongoDB object ID. So now when we store the details of the books inside this model, we're also going to store the author ID. And just out of that, we here pass comma and then specify the reference. So we call here a field called reference, and in the single quote, we pass author. Right now, we don't have this model inside this application. After a few seconds, I'm going to show you how you can create this author model. Just for now, let's save these changes. And then just out of that, just after this object, right down here, I'm going to call here a comma and call the timestamp. Just out of that, right down here, you have to export. So you have to say here mongoose.model, and inside a single quote, we call book. We're going to specify name to this model, which is book. And then we specify structure of it. The structure is stored inside this book model. So we pass that book model here. That's it. Just out of that, we also need to specify that if we already have a model, then use that default model or create a new one. So this statement is going to create a new model. If we already have the existing model, then use that. So we need to specify mongoose here dot model dot books. And here I'm going to pass or. So if we have existing model, then use that. Otherwise, create a new one. You can notice here how I use the plural name to these books. Whenever you create a MongoDB collection, MongoDB is going to specify the plural name to its collection. So if you want to access your collection, you have to specify the plural name to it. Just out of that, let me save the changes back to the author model.js, and right here, I'm going to create a schema of author. So I'm going to first import the mongoose. After that, I'm going to say here constant author model is equal to mongoose dot schema. And inside this, I'm going to add fields of author model. So I'm going to add name, bio, and website. To the name, we specify type string. To the bio, we specify type string. And to the website, the type is string. Just out of that, inside this author model, right down here, we call books fields. You can specify any name to these fields. That's upon you. I'm going to specify here books, pass here a comma, and specify an array here. Inside this array, you're going to have your books. So we specify here an object and specify here type. And inside this type, you specify mongoose dot schema dot types dot object ID. And then you specify here a comma and say reference of book. Now you don't have to specify here a plural name to this books collection. Now you can notice how I connect both these models using object ID. Inside this author model, I call the reference of the books collection. And inside this books model, I call the reference of the author collection. So inside this author model, when I create a new author, I can specify the books ID inside this array. The author can have multiple books. So inside this books, I'm going to store the ID of the book. Just out of that, I'm going to just export a default statement and export the authors. Now let me save the changes, save this file as well, and back to the app controller. And now let me show you can create the author. So I'm simply going to first import the author from the database data.js file. So if you open the database data.js file, here I have all the authors. I'm going to import that authors here. Just out of that, I'm going to import the author model. Just out of that, I'm also going to import the books model. So I'm going to import the books model here. And after that, I'm going to say export constant create author. And then I'm going to specify here the controller. And I'm going to specify async function with request and response parameter. And then call here an object. Something like this. And inside this, I'm going to first call the try and catch block. So I'm going to say here try and catch. Inside this catch, I'm going to response the status with 404 and then return the message with the error message. Just out of that, inside this try, I'm simply going to call the for loop and iterate over this object. So here, I'm simply going to call the for loop just like this and iterate over this object. I'm going to get this object one by one inside this variable. I'm going to call this author and then pass this author object to it. And then I'm going to save this author inside a database. So I call here new author.save. And at the end, I'm going to respond with the author created message. So now this controller is going to create all the authors and store that inside a MongoDB database. Let me just save the changes and then let me back to the route app route.js file. And here I'm going to first import the controllers. So I'm going to say here import star asterisk as app controller from, and then I'm going to specify here double dot forward slash specify controllers app controller.js. And after that, right here, I'm going to say router dot post. And then I'm going to create here the endpoint, which is create authors. And then I'm going to specify app controller dot create authors. So now when you try to access this create author endpoint, this is going to create all the authors and store that inside a MongoDB database. Let me just create few more controllers here. So I'm going to add create books endpoint, show endpoint, and author ID endpoint. So to get the individual author, we can just specify the author endpoint with the author ID. Now let's create all these controllers inside this app.controller file. Let me just save the changes back to the app controller and minimize this. So I'm going to say here export constant create books is equal to async request and response. And inside this, I'm going to call try and catch block. Inside this catch, I'm going to respond the status code with 404. And inside this try here, I'm going to first find the author. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable here, constant jk rollings is equal to await. And from the author, from this author model, I'm going to find, I'm going to say find one, and I'm going to find for the jk rollings author. So inside an object, I'm going to pass jk rollings. So if you're back to the data.js, then you will notice here, we have here jk rollings. I'm going to return this object from this statement. So this statement is going to return this object inside this variable. So if we have this jk rollings inside the author, then we are going to return that object inside this variable. And I'm going to do the same for the Tony Robbins as well. So I'm going to add here Tony Robbins, await, author, find one, Tony Robbins. Just for that, we need to store the books with these authors. What we need to do is, as you know, inside this books model, we need to store the author ID with the books details. As you can notice here, we already have the author details right inside these variables. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to create here a new object. I'm going to say here new book, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to call an object, and I'm going to pass values to these fields. So once you have your books model, you need to specify title, subtitle, and author ID. So inside this object, I'm simply going to paste the title, the subtitle, and the author. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to call this jk rollings object and get the ID of it and store that inside this author field right here. Just out of that, I'm going to do the same and create another book. So I'm going to copy and paste a book here, something like this, and store that object inside a variable. So let's do the same for the first object as well, just like this. Just out of that, once we have the books object, we can save both these objects. So I'm going to call both this variable and call save method of it. So this statement is going to save this data inside the MongoDB database. So now this statement is going to create a books model and store all the data inside a MongoDB database. Now just out of that, what I want to store these books inside the author model as well. So if you notice here, I have these books fields. Inside this, I need to specify the object ID. I need to specify the reference of the books collection. Right down here, just after this await, right here, we need to call jk rollings, the variable, dot books dot push. And we're going to push this Harry Potter variable right here. And we're going to do the same for the second variable as well, just like this. So I'm going to call both these variables, and inside that, I'm going to push both these books. And after that, we need to save both these variables as well. So to save this, I'm simply going to call await and call the save method. And at the end, we need to just response the JSON object. I'm going to say response.json books created. That's it. Now, just for that, let me back to the app.route. And you will notice here, I already have this app controller with this endpoint, create books, to create a books inside the MongoDB database. Now, just for that, let's see how we can show all the books and get the individual author. So I'm going to back to the app controller, minimize this controller, and right down here, I'm going to say export constant show all is equal to async function with request and response parameter, just like this. And inside this, I'm going to call try and catch block. Inside this catch, I'm going to say response dot status 404 and then return the error message. And inside this try, here I'm going to say constant authors is equal to await, then call the author model. So I'm going to call here author dot find. This find method is going to return all the authors. But what I also want the books as well with this author. So if you open this author model.js, then you will notice here we also need to get the books from the books collection. So what we can do is here we can call dot populate and then call here a parenthesis. And right here you need to specify the books collection, something like this. You need to specify the plural name of your collection. Just for that, right down here, I can simply return the JSON response with this variable. That's it. And at the end, I can simply create here the last endpoint. I'm simply going to say here export get author is equal to async request and response parameter. And then I'm going to call here try and catch block. And inside this catch right here, I'm simply going to return the 404 status. And inside this try here, I'm going to say constant author is equal to await, then call the author schema dot find by id. So to get the single user from this author id, we need to call here author dot find id, and inside that I'm going to say request dot params dot id. Now inside this params id, we're going to have the id of the books. So once we get the author inside this author variable, we're going to return that from the response.status. So we need to first populate the books as well with this author. So I'm going to say here dot populate, and inside this we need to specify the books collection. So we call here books. As you know, we need to specify the plural name of the books inside this populate function. Just out of that, right down here, we need to call here response.status, and then I'm going to call here status code 200 and the JSON response with the author variable. So once we have the get author, let me just save this file and back to the app route.js. And inside this, I'm going to have the app controller with the get author controller. Right here, I'm going to call the HTTP get method, then specify the author detail with the author ID, and then call the author with the controller. Now let me just test this API. So I'm going to save all the changes, save all these files, and then I'm going to open this Thunder client. Using this Thunder client, we are going to test this API. So let me just clear all these activities and create a new request. As you know, if I open this terminal, you can notice here, right down here, I have this server details. Let me copy this and specify that right inside this URL. And just after that, if you back to the server.js file, we need to specify here the API prefix to access the API. So I'm going to back to the new request, and here I'm going to call the /, then specify here API, and then specify the endpoints. So if I back to the app route, here we have all the endpoints. So let me just first access this show endpoint. Let me just specify here show, and this is a type of get request. So let me just specify here get and click on the send button. Right now, if I click on the send button, I'm not going to get anything because right now we don't have anything inside this author collection. What we need to do is we need to first store the authors and the books and then access all the data of the author and books collection. So I'm going to back to the Thunder client here. Let me save these changes. This will just create this activity log here, and we have the get request. Just out of that, let me just create a new request So inside this new request, I'm going to say here, create authors. I'm going to copy this endpoint, specify that here. This is a type of post request. So we pass here post and click on send button. Now when I click on send button, you can see we're going to have here a response called authors created. Now once we have this author created, let me create the books as well. So if you're back to the app route, we have here the endpoint called create books. Let's copy it and specify that right here. Now when you click on the send button, this is going to create all the books. As you can see, this is going to create all the books and store all the data inside a MongoDB database. So now let me just get all the details of the user. So let's click on this get request and let me show you all the details. Now when I click on the send button, you can see now we're going to have all the data of the user. So when I scroll down, we have all the data. You can notice here the first object is going to have the books object. Now inside this book object, we have the books details. You can notice. And we have the books details for the last author. So if I scroll down, here you can notice for the J.K. Rowling's, we have these books details. And if I try to access the individual user, so let's suppose that if I make a get request on this author endpoint, if I specify here author, this is type of get request, and then we need to specify the parameter. So I need to first get the user detail. So let me just back to the previous request, copy this user ID right from here, and then specify here comma forward slash, and then specify this user ID. Now because we have this ID variable, we need to specify value to it. So now once we specify value to it, this is the type of get request. When I click on send button, you can see now we're going to have the details of the user as a response. So we only going to have a single response from the author. You can notice here right inside this object, we're going to have the author detail as well as the books detail. Inside this books array, we're going to have the books detail. The Tony Robbins might have multiple books. So this is a very simple technique to create a second normalized form inside a MongoDB database. So if you find anything useful, make sure to press the like button, share this video with your friends, subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.